Hello, my name is Sherlock Holmes, and every story hides a truth. Welcome to my new mystery.
London slept beneath a veil of pale fog, the gas lamp struggling to pierce the dense mist that coiled along Baker Street like restless smoke. It was nearing midnight, and the only sound in the quiet rooms of 221B was the steady scratching of Holmes's pen as he annotated a case file spread across the table. The coal fire burned low, throwing red light over his sharp features, and the faint clink of a glass told me he was half aware of my presence, but entirely married to thought. I had just begun to drowse in my chair when the sound came. A sudden, frantic knocking at the door below. It was not the ordinary rap of a visitor, but a wild, desperate pounding that echoed through the stairwell and jolted Holmes upright. He glanced at the clock. 12 minutes past midnight. He murmured, an hour when only the troubled or the criminal seek my counsel. Before I could rise, Mrs. Hudson's hurried steps came from the hall, her voice breathless with alarm. "Mr. Holmes, sir. There's a lady below. In quite a state. She insists she must see you at once." Holmes straightened his coat, his expression sharpening into alert focus. "Show her in, Mrs. Hudson. And bring brandy. I fear we shall need it." Moments later, the woman entered, drenched in fog and trembling as though she had run from death itself. Her cloak was dark with mist. Her gloved hands knotted tightly around the handle of a small traveling case. She could not have been more than 30, yet fear had already carved lines around her eyes. "I beg your pardon, Mr. Holmes," she gasped, her voice quivering. I had no one else to turn to. "My name is Eliza Marchmont, and my husband is gone." Holmes motioned for her to sit. "Gone, Mrs. Marchmont? Pray, be precise. Do you mean he has left you, vanished, been taken?" Her eyes flicked between us, as though searching for disbelief. "Vanished. Last night, just after the clock struck 12, we both heard it, a knock. 3 times it came loud and hollow, echoing through the walls of Ravenscroft Manor. My husband went to investigate. He never returned." Holmes leaned back, fingers steepled. "And you did not follow?" "I tried. But the corridor was dark, and when I reached his study, the door was locked from the inside. I called his name, no answer. By morning I had the door forced open and—" She stopped, covering her mouth. "He was gone. His candle was extinguished, his chair overturned. Only his walking cane remained." A long silence followed. The only sound was the faint hiss of the fire. Holmes regarded her with that unnerving stillness he often adopted when thought and instinct began their dance. "You came to London this evening?" he said finally, his tone more statement than question. She blinked, startled. "Yes. I took the last train from Surrey." Holmes rose and paced slowly toward her, his eyes flicking to the hem of her skirt. "And yet, Mrs. Marchmont, you have walked through mud that is neither from a London street nor from any recent rain. The soil on your shoes, dark, clay-like, suggests you crossed a garden path freshly dug, perhaps near an old orchard." She gasped softly. "You are correct. Ravenscroft's orchard lies beyond the east wing, but I passed through it only briefly this morning while searching for my husband." Holmes's gaze hardened, his mind already stitching threads together. "Curious," he murmured. "For a woman in grief, you observe much. Tell me, Mrs. Marchmont, when you heard the knock, did you notice from where it came?" She hesitated. "It seemed to come from the very walls, but my husband always said the manor held strange echoes." Holmes exchanged a brief glance with me. "Coups rarely vanish a man, Watson. Would you agree?" "Qui," I said, watching as Holmes poured a measure of brandy and handed it to her. "You mentioned a locked door, Mrs. Marchmont. Was there a window in the study?" "There was, Doctor. But it was fastened from within. We had to break it to open the room." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "And no sign of forced entry? No footprints in the garden?" "None that I could see. Only the prints of my husband's boots, leading from the hall to the study." Holmes tapped his finger against his chin. "Interesting. A man vanishes from a locked room, leaving no trace of exit. You have the makings of a most unorthodox haunting. Marchmont." Her voice trembled. "You jest, Mr. Holmes, but the servants swear the knocks began the night after my husband dismissed his partner from their business. They said it was an omen, one that came for him at last." "An omen," Holmes repeated dryly. "More often a man's guilt takes the shape of superstition. What line of business is your husband in?" "Manufacturing. His firm supplied parts for the Admiralty. He dealt often with military contracts." That caught Holmes's attention. "And his partner, the man he dismissed?" "Colonel Hensley," she said. "A retired officer. There were disagreements, money, accusations of deception, but my husband insisted it was settled." Holmes turned away, moving toward the fire, the glow catching in his keen eyes. "Colonel Hensley," he repeated softly. "Watson, do you recall the name in last week's papers? A colonel accused of selling military designs abroad." I frowned, recalling the article. "Yes, though the charges were dropped, lack of evidence." Holmes smiled faintly. Lack of evidence, yet evidence rarely remains hidden for long, especially when one knows where to knock. Mrs. Marchmont looked from one of us to the other, bewildered. "You believe this is connected to my husband's business?" "I believe," Holmes said, his tone suddenly clipped with certainty, "that your husband's disappearance is no spectral visitation, but an elaborate contrivance, a crime wrapped in theatrics. And if I am correct, the first act began long before the midnight knocking." He turned to her briskly. "You will return to Ravenscroft Manor tomorrow morning. Watson and I will accompany you." Her eyes widened with relief. "You mean, you will take the case?" "Indeed. There is a logic beneath even the most haunting sound, Mrs. Marchmont. We shall find its rhythm soon enough." The woman rose shakily, clutching her case to her chest. "I can never thank you enough, Mr. Holmes. I fear what I shall find, but I must know the truth." Holmes gave a small, reassuring bow. "Truth has a way of knocking, Mrs. Marchmont. It merely requires one to listen." When she had gone, silence settled again over the room. The fog pressed against the windows and the fire guttered low. I studied Holmes as he stood by the window, watching the ghostly street beyond. "You believe the husband alive, then?" I asked. "For now," he replied. The soil upon her shoes, the timing of her arrival, the mention of military contracts, all too deliberate. A frightened wife may conceal more than grief. He turned, eyes bright with the chase. "Watson, have you ever known me to resist a mystery that begins with a knock after midnight?" I smiled warily. "Never." Holmes's expression grew distant, thoughtful. "Then let us see where this one leads. I suspect the echoes of Ravenscroft Manor will not keep their silence for long." Outside, the city seemed to hold its breath. The last stroke of midnight faded into the fog, leaving behind a silence so deep it seemed almost to listen back. And somewhere in that stillness, faint as a memory, I could have sworn I heard it. A slow, deliberate knocking, far away but unmistakable. 3 times, measured and hollow. Holmes's eyes lifted, and for the briefest moment, I saw in them something rare, not doubt, but a kind of anticipation, as though he too had heard the sound and recognized it for what it was. "The game, Watson," he said quietly, reaching for his coat. "It has already begun." The morning broke gray and reluctant, a thin drizzle hanging in the London air like breath upon glass. Holmes had been awake since before dawn, his lean figure outlined against the misted window of 2021B Baker Street. I found him there still, the smoke of his pipe curling upward in ghostly ribbons as he studied the countryside timetable spread before him. He had slept not at all, yet his eyes were keen, bright with that unmistakable fever that always accompanied the scent of mystery. "You will note, Watson," he said without turning, "that the train to Guildford departs within the hour. Ravenscroft Manor lies but a few miles beyond. We must reach it before the day has a chance to forget the tracks of the night." I nodded, half amused by his urgency. "Do you expect the grounds to yield much evidence after a day's passing?" Holmes glanced back, a faint smile tugging at his mouth. "Evidence, my dear fellow, is like music. It is not the note that matters, but the echo that lingers." By 7:30, we were seated in a second-class carriage, the rhythmic clatter of wheels underscoring our silence. Mrs. Marchmont sat across from us, pale and withdrawn, her gloved hands twisted together in her lap. The landscape rolled by in a blur of wet fields and bare trees, the fog clinging stubbornly to the hedgerows. From time to time, Holmes observed her with a sidelong glance, not out of pity but out of quiet study, like a man listening for a discordant tone in a familiar melody. At last she spoke, her voice low. "The manor has stood for centuries. My husband often said it held memories older than our own bloodline." I laughed at the thought once. She hesitated. "Now I do not." Holmes tapped the ash from his pipe. "The human imagination is a skilled architect, Mrs. Marchmont. It builds phantoms where logic would suffice." Her lips trembled faintly. "And yet, Mr. Holmes, logic cannot explain the sound I heard. The knocks came from inside the walls. They were not echoes." Holmes inclined his head politely, but his eyes remained distant. "All walls whisper, madam, especially those with secrets buried behind them." We arrived at the small, lonely station of Ravenscroft just before noon. The sky hung low and colorless, the surrounding countryside swallowed in mist. A coach awaited us, a relic of better days, its black paint dulled and its driver silent as a statue. As we approached the manor, the air seemed to grow colder, the path narrowing between twisted yews that leaned like watchful sentinels. Ravenscroft Manor emerged from the fog with a grim majesty, its stone facade darkened by age and neglect. A single chimney coughed pale smoke into the wind, and the high windows stared blankly over the grounds. The house gave the impression not merely of emptiness, but of something waiting, something listening. Holmes's sharp gaze swept the structure before we crossed the threshold. "Observe, Watson, the ivy has been freshly cut away near the east wing. A curious act, considering the season. Perhaps the gardener's work," I suggested. "Or perhaps concealment," he murmured. "We shall see." Inside, the manor was hushed. The air carried that faint, oppressive chill peculiar to large houses long unoccupied or poorly kept. A servant in livery met us, an elderly man named Briggs, whose eyes darted nervously toward the ceiling with every creak of the old beams. "It happens every night, sir," he whispered hoarsely. "3 knocks, clear as you please, right on the stroke of 12. Comes from the study, though the master's been gone these 3 days." Holmes regarded him coolly. "And you have remained?" Briggs swallowed. "Someone had to mind the house, sir. Though I'll not stay another night." Holmes's expression did not change, but I saw the glimmer of satisfaction that meant a piece of his puzzle had begun to fit. "Show me the study," he said. The study of Edward Marchmont was a large, oak-paneled chamber heavy with the scent of old books and extinguished tobacco. A wide desk stood before a window overlooking the orchard, its surface scattered with papers, a candlestick, and the walking cane Mrs. Marchmont had described. The broken latch upon the window bore mute testimony to the forced entry she had ordered. Holmes circled the room slowly, touching nothing, his eyes flicking from floor to ceiling. Then he knelt near the hearth, where a faint dusting of white powder clung to the bricks. He touched a finger to it, sniffed, and smiled faintly. "Gunpowder residue," he said. "Yet no firearm lies within sight, an unusual perfume for a gentleman's study." He moved next to the window, inspecting the frame with his magnifying glass. Scratches upon the latch, fresh and made from within. Whoever opened this did so in haste, and recently. I followed his gaze to the cane upon the desk. "You believe Marchmont may have returned?" Holmes shook his head. "No. But someone has been here since his disappearance." Marchmont stood near the door, visibly trembling. "Mr. Holmes, what are you implying?" "That your husband's vanishing was neither sudden nor solitary," he said calmly. "He may have had assistance or interference." As he spoke, the faintest sound echoed from somewhere beyond the walls, a dull rhythmic tapping. Once, twice, thrice, each knock deep and measured, as though delivered from the bones of the house itself. Mrs. Marchmont gave a strangled cry, and even I felt the hairs rise on the back of my neck. Holmes, however, only tilted his head, listening. "Precisely at midday," he murmured. "Fascinating. The hour varies, but the pattern does not." He strode to the wall opposite the hearth and pressed his ear against the paneling. "Hollow," he muttered. "Watson, the poker, if you please." I handed it to him, and he rapped gently upon the wood. The hollow sound deepened toward the corner, and after a moment's searching, his fingers found a nearly invisible seam running along the panel's edge. With a sudden motion, he pressed inward, and a narrow section of the wall gave way, revealing a dark passage descending steeply into shadow. Mrs. Marchmont recoiled. "Good heavens, what is that?" "A servant's corridor, most likely," Holmes said, though his tone carried a note of satisfaction, or something older still. He lit a lantern from the desk and peered inside. The air that rose from the opening was cold, metallic, and thick with the scent of damp stone. "Watson, stay close." We descend. The narrow passage wound downward behind the fireplace, its walls rough and sweating with moisture. At intervals, small iron hooks protruded from the masonry, relics of some forgotten use. The floor was littered with dust and fragments of brick, yet near the bottom, Holmes knelt again. "Footprints," he said softly. "2 sets, one large, one small. The larger returns upward, the smaller vanishes beyond that turn. Observe the smudge here. Ash mixed with clay. The same substance from Mrs. Marchmont's shoes." I turned toward her, but she only shook her head violently. "I swear to you, Mr. Holmes, I never came down here." Holmes regarded her for a long moment, unreadable. Then he raised the lantern higher. The corridor ended abruptly at a narrow wooden door, half rotted and bound with rusted iron. Its surface bore 3 distinct indentations, round, spaced evenly apart. "The knocks," Holmes murmured. He reached out, pressing his fingertips to the marks. "They were made from this side, Watson. Someone struck the door from within." The realization chilled me. Then, someone was trapped here. Precisely. Holmes produced his pocket knife, pried open the latch, and the door creaked slowly inward, revealing a small chamber barely large enough for 2 men to stand. Inside was a rough table, a broken lantern, and the charred remains of paper scattered across the floor. Holmes bent to examine one piece still half intact. The ink had run, but a single phrase remained legible: "Deliver at midnight." 3 knocks. Holmes's face darkened. A signal, then, not a haunting. The knocks mark a message, or an exchange. He turned sharply to Mrs. Marchmont. "Madam, I must insist, was your husband engaged in any dealings beyond his business partnership, any that required secrecy?" She hesitated, color draining from her face. "There were occasional visits, men who came late after I had retired. My husband said they concerned military matters. Designs, prototypes. I was forbidden to ask questions." Holmes stood, his voice suddenly hard. "And you obeyed?" Tears welled in her eyes. "He was my husband," he sighed, the edge softening.
"Yes."
"And perhaps his greatest deception was convincing you that loyalty demanded blindness." The wind moaned faintly through the hidden corridor as he turned back toward the stair. Watson, this room tells us one truth plainly. Whatever Marchmont sought to conceal, he buried it beneath his own hearth. Whether he vanished by choice or by consequence, that secret lies at the heart of it. We emerged once more into the dim light of the study. The walls seemed to breathe around us, as though the house itself listened. Holmes extinguished the lantern, his expression set in grim thought. "We return here tonight," he said finally. "At midnight, when the house remembers." Mrs. Marchmont shuddered. "You mean to stay?" "Indeed," Holmes replied, his tone almost serene. "If the walls of Ravenscroft have learned to knock, let them. We shall see who answers." And as the afternoon light faded into shadow and the first fingers of fog crept once more across the fields, I could not shake the feeling that the house was waiting. For nightfall, for the hour of its strange ritual, for the sound that had begun it all. 3 knocks, measured and patient, as though time itself were counting down. Night returned to Ravenscroft like a tide of ink, swallowing what little light the manor had permitted through its narrow, ancient windows. By the time the last glow of sunset had vanished beyond the orchards, the house seemed to retreat into itself, its corridors shrinking, its air thickening with a silence that was almost sentient. Holmes and I had taken up our post in the study, the only room with a view of the east wing and the orchard beyond. Mrs. Marchmont had retired early, pleading exhaustion, though her eyes betrayed more fear than fatigue. Holmes sat in the high, back chair near the fireplace, his lean form bent forward slightly, elbows on knees, the faint gleam of a cigar ember marking his steady breath. The faint ticking of his pocket watch filled the intervals between the crackling of the fire. I, for my part, was struggling to banish the sense of unease that the hidden passage had impressed upon me. Every gust of wind through the chimney made the shadows dance across the walls, and the house answered with soft groans of settling timber, each one a whisper too deliberate to feel accidental. "Holmes," I murmured at length, breaking the tension, "you are certain the sounds we heard last night were no mere superstition?" He did not lift his gaze from the fire. "Superstition is a language of ignorance, Watson. Yet even ignorance describes a pattern. The trick is to translate it." He drew upon his cigar, eyes half-lidded. "The knocks occur at precise intervals, too measured for random disturbance. The hollow panel, the sealed chamber, these are not the work of phantoms but of human ingenuity. Still," he paused, the ember flaring as he exhaled, "there is something in this house that eludes ordinary explanation. I can feel it pressing against the walls, like a thought half-remembered." A log in the hearth collapsed with a dull thud, sending a spray of sparks up the chimney. The clock on the mantel ticked toward midnight, 11:59, the brass hands glinting faintly in the firelight. Holmes straightened, his entire posture changing, alive with attention. He set the cigar in the tray, his expression carved in quiet expectation. And then it came, 3 knocks. Deep, deliberate, resonant as the toll of a hidden bell. 1, 2, 3. The sound rolled through the chamber, seeming to come from every wall at once. The air grew colder. My hand went instinctively to the revolver in my coat pocket, though I knew full well that bullets were useless against the unknown. Holmes rose silently and motioned for me to douse the fire. The flames shrank, plunging the room into a dim, orange half-light. The knocking ceased, but in its wake came something worse. A low, fluttering murmur that seemed to ripple through the walls themselves. It was not words, not exactly, but a suggestion of speech, like the sighing of a dozen unseen mouths. Holmes's eyes gleamed in the dark. "Do you hear it, Watson?" "God help me, yes. It's everywhere." "Not everywhere," he corrected softly. "Listen closely. It comes from the east wall, near the fireplace." He crossed the room swiftly, his movements precise, and pressed his ear against the paneling. For a moment he stood perfectly still, the only sound our own breathing and that strange whispering pulse behind the wood. Then he withdrew, his expression unreadable. "Fetch the lantern." I obeyed, lighting it with trembling fingers. The narrow beam revealed the faint outline of the hidden seam we had uncovered earlier, now half concealed again by shadows. Holmes knelt and ran his fingers along it, his brow furrowing. "There's air movement here. Cold, constant. The passage breathes, Watson. Something within is open to the outside." He pressed upon the panel, it gave way, revealing once again the narrow passage that led downward. The darkness beyond the lantern's glow seemed almost alive, waiting. "We shall go?" he said simply. I hesitated. "Holmes, must we, now?" He turned to me, that familiar spark of fierce curiosity in his eyes. "Midnight. Watson, it is when the house performs its confession. Come." We descended carefully into the passage, the lantern's light flickering against the damp stone. The air grew colder with each step, thick with the earthy scent of mildew and old smoke. The faint whisper we had heard in the study was louder here, vibrating faintly through the walls like breath against the skin. When we reached the lower chamber, the same we had discovered earlier, it was not as we had left it. The scattered papers on the floor had shifted, their edges fluttering as if stirred by a draft. Though there was no wind, the table now bore a dark stain, fresh and irregular. Holmes set the lantern upon it and leaned in. "Blood," he said quietly, still tacky, "no more than a few hours old." A chill crawled up my spine. Then someone has been here since we searched the place. Indeed. Perhaps even now they remain. He turned toward the far wall, where a series of thin cracks ran up the stone like veins. Pressing his palm against it, he frowned. There is space beyond this wall, hollow again. But this one hums. I listened closely and heard it too, a faint, continuous vibration, low and steady. It was not mechanical, no ticking or grinding, but almost organic, like the sound of a man breathing behind a door. Holmes moved quickly, withdrawing a small chisel and hammer from his coat. He had anticipated such a need, as always. With careful strikes, he loosened a section of stone until a narrow gap appeared. He held the lantern close and the light fell upon what lay beyond. A face, or rather, the pale impression of one. Drawn upon the wall itself in soot and oil, crude yet unmistakable. The features were smeared, the eyes hollow circles, the mouth stretched wide in what looked like a silent scream. Beneath it, words had been scrawled hastily in the same black substance. "He knocks for forgiveness." A Mrs. Marchmont's voice, trembling and faint, came from behind us. "Dear God, what is this?" We turned sharply. She stood in the doorway of the passage, her night robe clutched tight around her shoulders. Her face was white as chalk. "Madame," Holmes's voice cut through the dark. "You should not have come. I could not sleep," she whispered. I heard the knocks again, and then footsteps.
"I thought you... Oh, Mr. Holmes, what have you found?"
Holmes gestured for calm. "A warning, perhaps, or a confession. It appears your husband, or someone close to him, used this chamber as a kind of message vault. Do you recognize that phrase?" She stared at the writing, her lips moving without sound. "He knocks for forgiveness. No, I've never..." "Wait." She clutched the wall for support. The night before he disappeared, he said those very words. We were in the library. He had been drinking heavily. He said, "When the third knock comes, I shall be forgiven or damned." I thought it nonsense. Holmes's face darkened. "Nonsense often hides truth, Mrs. Marchmont. Tell me, did your husband have enemies besides Colonel Hensley?" Her answer was a whisper. Only himself. Before Holmes could respond, a new sound rose through the floorboards, a muffled thud, followed by the unmistakable creak of a door somewhere above. The house, it seemed, was waking. Holmes extinguished the lantern and motioned us to silence. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, descending the stairs above. Each one sank into the silence with dreadful clarity. We waited in the dark, scarcely daring to breathe. The steps halted near the entrance to the study, then resumed, turning toward the passage we occupied. Holmes's hand closed around my shoulder, steady and commanding. I could feel the tension radiating from him, coiled alert. The faint glimmer of lamplight appeared at the top of the passage, swaying as if carried by an unseen hand. Then, just as suddenly, it vanished. A moment later came the sound we had come to dread, 3 knocks, slow and measured, this time against the very door of the chamber in which we hid. Marchmont stifled a cry. Holmes pressed a finger to his lips, his other hand slipping silently into his coat pocket. From it, he drew a small pistol, sleek and oiled. "Who's there?" I called, before I could stop myself. The question hung in the air unanswered. Holmes waited several seconds, then moved forward and flung open the door. The corridor beyond was empty. The light we had seen was gone, the air still and cold. Only the faint echo of the knocks remained, fading upward into the bones of the house. Holmes lowered his weapon, eyes narrowing. "Whoever plays this game is skilled, Watson. They know the house intimately, and they mean to unnerve us before revealing themselves." A Mrs. Marchmont clung to the doorway, trembling. "You mean there is someone alive doing this?"
"Alive, yes,"
Holmes said grimly, "though perhaps not for long if they continue with such carelessness. Fear, Watson, is the most efficient weapon. It makes the rational man see ghosts in his own home." We returned to the study, locking the hidden door behind us. The fire had long since died, leaving the room dim and cold. Holmes went to the window and stared out into the orchard, where the fog drifted in pale ribbons under the moonlight. After a long silence, he spoke, his voice low. "The knocking was not supernatural, Watson. It was a signal. Perhaps to the grounds beyond, perhaps to the orchard itself. There is machinery somewhere in this house. A system designed to carry sound through the walls. Pipes, ducts, hollow beams. Someone has turned the house into an instrument of fear." He turned then, his eyes glinting. "Tomorrow, we search the orchard. I suspect the whispers will be louder there." And as the wind rose outside, sweeping through the trees like a breath drawn by unseen lungs, the house gave a final, gentle creak. 3 soft, hollow beats that echoed through the stillness before dying away. Holmes did not flinch. He merely listened, and when the sound was gone, he said quietly, "The house speaks, Watson. But not in words. It waits for us to understand its language." The morning came reluctantly, as though the sun itself hesitated to rise over Ravenscroft. Pale light crept across the frost-touched orchard, turning every branch into a spidery silhouette against the fog. The air was damp and cold, and the silence of the estate was heavier than the night that had preceded it. Not a bird stirred among the twisted trees, not a sound broke the uneasy calm, save for the faint murmur of Holmes's boots against the gravel as he strode toward the orchard path, his coat flaring like a shadow behind him. I followed close, my breath clouding in the chill. Mrs. Marchmont had remained indoors at Holmes's insistence, though not without visible relief. The events of the previous night had shaken her profoundly. I suspected her spirit had reached its limits. Holmes, however, seemed invigorated, as though the darker the mystery, the brighter his mind burned. He carried with him a small notebook, a magnifying lens, and the familiar walking stick he used when a trail demanded precision. "The air tells us more than any confession," he said quietly as we passed beneath the first of the orchard's gnarled boughs. "Do you notice, Watson, how the fog lies thicker here than by the house? It clings to the ground, unnatural for morning mist. There must be warmth beneath the soil, some manner of concealed vent or outlet." I scanned the misted rows of trees. The orchard was vast, its boundaries lost in white haze. An outlet. "You think the knocking may be connected to this place physically?" "Undoubtedly," he replied. "The vibration of the sound was not contained by walls alone. It traveled through the structure, which suggests the origin lies beneath the foundation or the surrounding earth. The whispering walls, Watson, were not whispering at all, they were echoing." He knelt suddenly, brushing his fingers through the soil. It was damp, darker than the surrounding ground, and faintly disturbed. "Footprints," he murmured, leaning closer. "Old, too, perhaps 3 days past. See the narrow heel, the worn sole. A man of medium build, accustomed to travel. He came this way more than once." I bent beside him. "Do you suppose Marchmont himself walked here?" "Possible," Holmes said, rising, "but improbable. The stride is too light for a man in fear. Whoever it was returned frequently and without caution." He gazed down the mist-shrouded path ahead. Let us see where his curiosity led him. We followed the faint impressions through the orchard. As we moved deeper, the fog grew denser, swallowing the manor from sight. The air was unnaturally still, heavy with the scent of damp wood and something else, something faintly acrid metallic. It reminded me of the residue Holmes had found near the hearth. After several minutes, the footprints stopped before a low rise of earth near the eastern boundary. At first, I saw nothing unusual, but Holmes crouched, sweeping aside fallen leaves with brisk efficiency. Beneath them lay a patch of disturbed soil, flattened then hastily covered. "Graves, perhaps?" I asked, my voice low. Holmes gave a small, mirthless smile. "If so, we shall hope they rest uneasily." He drew a small spade from the inner pocket of his coat, a tool he seemed always to have on hand for such occasions, and began to dig carefully. The earth yielded quickly, soft and fresh. Within moments, the edge of something metallic emerged. He wiped the dirt away to reveal a small, cylindrical tube of brass, capped tightly at both ends. Its surface was engraved with a faint insignia, a pair of wings encircling a letter A. "Royal Air Division," Holmes said under his breath. "Watson, we are far from the realm of superstition now." He twisted the cap free. Inside was a tightly folded sheet of parchment, the ink smudged by moisture but still legible. Holmes held it up to the light filtering through the mist. The message was brief, written in a hurried hand: "Deliver the plans before the third signal. Delay means discovery. Trust no one, not even her." Holmes read it twice, then tucked it carefully away. His expression was thoughtful, but his eyes had sharpened to a glint of ice. "The third signal," he murmured. 3 knocks, a code. "Watson, one meant to mark the completion of an exchange." "You believe Marchmont was involved in espionage?" I asked. "Espionage, or betrayal," Holmes replied. "He dealt in Admiralty designs. The missing plans for the new aerial guidance systems, if memory serves, vanished from official hands a fortnight ago. I read of it briefly in the Times." He rose, scanning the trees. This orchard was his meeting ground. Whoever orchestrated the exchange used the house's own structure to signal the appointed hour. Ingenious. Sound carries cleanly through the hollow pipes of the heating system. Every midnight, the knocks called the conspirator to the orchard. I shivered, glancing back toward the manor now half swallowed in fog. And the disappearance. Holmes's mouth tightened. A complication. Either he feared discovery and fled, or his accomplice ensured his silence. He turned to retrace our steps, but stopped abruptly, his gaze fixed upon the ground ahead, where the soil gave way to a faint trail of prints leading away from the disturbed patch. These were fresh, perhaps hours old, and lighter than the earlier ones. "Another visitor," he said softly, "smaller feet, a woman's." Before I could respond, a sound drifted through the fog. A faint crunch of movement, no more than 30 yards away. We froze. Through the shifting mist, a shadow moved between the trees. Tall, deliberate, gliding with the quiet precision of someone well acquainted with stealth. Holmes motioned for silence and crouched low, his eyes following the dark figure as it wove through the orchard. It paused briefly near the very spot where we had uncovered the brass tube, then knelt, running its hands through the soil. A moment later, the figure straightened, realizing the object was gone. Holmes whispered, "Stay here." Then, like smoke, he vanished into the fog. I waited, my heart hammering. The mist muffled all sound, turning each breath into a phantom. Then came the sudden rustle of movement, a brief struggle, and the dull thud of someone falling against the earth. I rushed forward, revolver drawn. When I reached the clearing, Holmes was standing calmly, his hand gripping the collar of a man dressed in a dark overcoat and cap. Mud streaked the intruder's face, and a thin trickle of blood ran from his temple where Holmes had evidently subdued him. "A trespasser with secrets," Holmes said coldly, "and one who came prepared to recover what we have already claimed." The man glared up at us, breathing hard. His accent, when he spoke, was rough and foreign, continental. "You should not have come here. You do not understand what you touch." "On the contrary," Holmes replied evenly, "I understand precisely what I touch: treason, deceit, and the ghost of a man who never truly vanished." The man sneered. "You think Marchmont is dead? Then you know nothing." Before Holmes could respond, the man wrenched free with sudden, violent strength, knocking the revolver from my hand. He bolted into the fog, vanishing as quickly as he had appeared. Holmes gave chase without hesitation, and I followed, branches whipping at my face as we tore through the orchard. We caught sight of him only briefly, a shadow darting between trees, his footsteps scattering leaves. But as we neared the boundary wall, the ground dipped sharply, and the man stumbled. Holmes seized him by the coat, dragging him up. "Enough," Holmes hissed. "You will tell me." The sentence died in his throat. The man's eyes rolled upward, his body convulsing once. Holmes caught him as he collapsed, and I saw then the foam gathering at his lips. His face twisted, jaw clenching tight. Holmes forced his mouth open, but it was too late. The bitter smell of cyanide rose from his breath. "Poison," Holmes muttered grimly. "A loyal servant to the end." We lowered the body to the ground. The fog closed in around us, silent once more. Holmes examined the dead man's coat, finding little. Only a pocket watch stopped at 12, and a folded scrap of paper bearing the same winged insignia. He stared at it for a long moment, then pocketed both items. The third knock meant completion, Watson. But now I fear it marked something else, the end of one conspiracy, and the beginning of another. As we made our way back toward the manor, the fog seemed to thicken until even the trees were ghosts. I could see only Holmes's outline ahead of me, his figure half absorbed by the mist. Yet even now his voice came clear and steady through the cold. "Tonight the truth will come to call," he said, "and when it does we must be the ones to answer." And somewhere behind us, faint as a heartbeat through the fog, came that dreadful, familiar sound, 3 hollow knocks, echoing from the depths of the orchard as if the earth itself demanded to be heard. Night fell upon Ravenscroft Manor like a closing shroud. The fog that had lingered through the day thickened into a pale, breathing wall around the estate, swallowing the last trace of the orchard beyond. Lamps burned low in the corridor, their flames wavering as though stirred by an unseen draught, and each tick of the great clock in the hall reverberated like a heartbeat counting down to some unseen hour of reckoning. Holmes had spoken little since our discovery in the orchard. He had spent the evening in the study, moving between the desk, the fireplace, and the peculiar grooves in the floorboards that he had examined earlier. Every so often, he would pause to jot a note or hum an indistinct tune, a habit he displayed when his mind was balanced between clarity and revelation. Mrs. Marchmont remained in her room under the care of the housemaid. She was nearly hysterical when informed of the intruder's death, insisting that the manor itself had cursed any who sought its secrets. Holmes had dismissed her fears gently but firmly. "The only curse upon this house, madam," he said, "is the handiwork of men too clever for conscience and too foolish for discretion." And now, as the hour approached midnight, I joined him in the dimly lit study. A single candle burned beside him, its wax pooled beneath like molten ivory. Holmes stood near the hearth, his face half lit, his eyes glinting with an inward fire. "It will come tonight," he said without looking up. "The pattern demands it. The first 3 knocks marked communication. The 4th will mark culmination. You believe someone will return?" I asked quietly. "Not return," he corrected. "Reveal." He crossed to the desk, where the brass tube and the dead man's pocket watch lay side by side. He turned the watch over in his hand. "Midnight, Watson. The hour of the 4th signal. But tonight the sender and the receiver are both silent, which means the mechanism, whatever its true nature, is acting alone. A program of sorts, set into motion long before. Before I could speak, he pressed his palm against the wall behind the desk. The faintest vibration ran through it, subtle but distinct. He smiled thinly. "You feel it. The air itself trembles. The device is primed. I felt the vibration deepen, a faint rhythmic pulse beneath the surface, almost alive. Holmes turned sharply, seizing the lantern from the mantel. "Come, Watson. The source lies below. I must see the thing with my own eyes before the hour strikes." We moved quickly through the corridor, down the narrow flight of stairs that led toward the cellars. The air grew colder with each step, carrying the scent of mildew and stone. Our footsteps echoed strangely, as though the house itself listened. Holmes's lantern threw long, quivering shadows across the brickwork. At the base of the stairway, he paused before a heavy wooden door banded with iron. "Behind this," he murmured. "I suspected as much earlier, when I traced the hollow resonance of the walls. This is no mere storage cellar." He knelt, examining the lock, and within moments it yielded to his skillful manipulation. The door creaked open on rusted hinges, releasing a breath of air so cold it felt almost wet. Beyond lay a narrow passage descending deeper underground. We advanced slowly, the lantern revealing rough-hewn stone, and after a few yards, a curious arrangement of pipes running along the ceiling. Holmes traced one with his fingertips. "Heating conduits," he said. "But these have been tampered with. See how the joints have been soldered anew." The knocks we heard were not spectral echoes, Watson. They were mechanical. Steam pressure, released at timed intervals through concealed vents. He raised the lantern higher, and I saw at once the evidence of his claim. A small brass valve half hidden behind the masonry, its lever glinting with moisture. Controlled from above, most likely from within the study. Holmes continued. "Marchmont built this system to serve two masters. His household by day and his secret by night. We followed the passage until it widened into a low, vaulted chamber beneath the manor. The lantern's light caught the edges of machinery. Wheels, pulleys, and a large copper tank connected to an intricate lattice of pipes. A single chain dangled from the ceiling beside a small iron lever. Beneath it, the floor was marked by soot and blackened residue. Holmes examined the contraption with growing fascination. "Crude but ingenious," he murmured. "Pressure generated here transferred through the pipes, released in sequence to create the knocks. But look, these additions are not Marchmont's doing." He pointed to the wiring coiled along the base of the tank, newer, insulated, modern. "Someone modified this recently." Before I could respond, a sudden metallic hiss filled the chamber. The pipes shuddered violently, and a hollow boom rolled through the walls above. "The sound of the first knock, midnight," Holmes said under his breath. "We are too late to stop it." Another knock thundered, shaking dust from the ceiling. Then a third. Holmes moved swiftly, scanning the machinery. "There is something triggering this," he said, his voice sharp with concentration. "Find the source of the wiring. Follow it, Watson." I did as instructed, tracing the wire along the wall until it disappeared into a small panel. Holmes pried it open with his knife, revealing a simple timing mechanism powered by a spring-driven gear. But there was more. A second wire ran from it into the floor beneath the copper tank. Holmes crouched, frowning. "This is no mere signaling device," he said. "It's a detonator." Before he could reach for the lever, the fourth knock sounded, louder than all the rest, resonating through every inch of stone. For a split second the air seemed to freeze, then a muffled crack split the silence. A puff of smoke burst from the base of the tank. Holmes seized my arm and pulled me backward as the entire mechanism groaned, shuddering as though the earth itself shifted beneath us. We stumbled into the passage just as part of the chamber wall collapsed inward, revealing a hidden space beyond. Through the swirling dust, I glimpsed something glinting in the lantern's light. A heavy iron door, half collapsed, its hinges wrenched open by the force of the blast. Holmes coughed, waving the smoke aside, then advanced toward the breach. "A vault," he said, "the true heart of the mystery." Inside lay what appeared to be an underground study, a smaller replica of the one above. Papers were strewn across a metal desk, some singed by fire, others damp with condensation. A safe stood open against the far wall, its contents rifled. The air was thick with the scent of oil and decay. Holmes began to sift through the debris. "Blueprints," he muttered. "Engineering diagrams, naval instruments." This was no hiding place, Watson. It was a workshop. Marchmont was building something, or perhaps copying something. He lifted a half-burnt folder from the desk, its cover stamped with the same winged insignia we had seen before. Inside were fragments of technical drawings, schematics for a mechanical guidance system bearing Admiralty seals. "Stolen designs," Holmes said grimly. "He meant to sell them, no doubt, to our deceased friend in the orchard. The exchange failed, and so the accomplice sought to erase every trace of the connection. The detonator was meant to destroy this vault and any evidence within." He stood, surveying the chamber. But something went wrong. Marchmont was trapped here. The explosion sealed him in before his scheme could complete itself. The knocks, the signals, they continued on their own, an echo of his failure. As he spoke, a faint sound stirred from the far corner, a creak almost human. I swung the lantern toward it, and both of us froze. The outline of a figure lay slumped against the wall, half covered in debris. Holmes approached cautiously, brushing away the dust. It was indeed a man, what remained of one, his face drawn and pale, his hands locked around a small brass key. Marchmont, Holmes said softly, the architect of his own undoing. We stood in silence for a long moment. Then Holmes straightened, the faintest trace of melancholy softening his expression. He built his own prison, Watson, and when the mechanism turned against him, there was no one left to hear his plea. The fourth knock was not a warning. It was his requiem. The pipes still groaned faintly overhead, their rhythm fading into stillness. Holmes turned toward the passage. Come. There is one more matter to settle before dawn. The widow deserves the truth, harsh though it may be. As we climbed back into the upper hall, the great clock struck 1. The sound reverberated through the manor, clear and solemn. I glanced at Holmes, whose gaze lingered on the shadows curling beneath the ceiling beams. Strange, I said quietly. To think all this noise, all this terror, was the work of one man and his machines. Holmes gave a small nod. The world, my dear Watson, is seldom haunted by the dead. It is haunted by the living, and by the lies they tell to silence the past. He turned away then, the faint glow of the dying lantern hallowing his face in pale gold. Somewhere deep within the manor, the pipes released a final sigh, like the house exhaling after holding its breath too long. And in that silence, broken only by our footsteps, it felt as though Ravenscroft itself had finally told its story, and was, at last, free to sleep. The dawn crept slowly across Ravenscroft, bleeding pale light through the cracks in the boarded windows. The storm that had threatened the night before never broke, but its ghost lingered, air heavy with the scent of ozone and damp earth. Holmes and I had not slept. The events of the night, the explosion beneath the house, the discovery of Marchmont's body, had left neither of us in a state suited to rest. The house was eerily quiet now, as though mourning the secret it had harbored for so long. Only the steady ticking of the clock in the hall reminded us that time, indifferent to tragedy, continued its march forward. Holmes sat at the desk in the upper study, his eyes fixed upon the open window through which the gray morning seeped. The remnants of the night's discoveries lay scattered across the table, fragments of Marchmont's blueprints, the dead man's pocket watch, and the brass key clutched in the hand of the corpse we had found below. He turned the key slowly between his fingers, lost in thought. There is an irony to it, Watson, he said at last, his tone low and reflective. A man buries his conscience beneath the floor and finds himself buried with it. Marchmont built his own tomb, sealed by his own mechanism, driven by greed disguised as ingenuity. I poured a cup of coffee, its steam curling upward into the cold air. And yet, I said, there remains the question of his accomplice. The man who died in the orchard was no solitary thief. There was another, someone who altered the machinery, who set that detonator. Holmes's eyes flickered, a spark of life stirring behind their exhaustion. Yes, he murmured, the hand behind the final design, and I believe we shall find that hand closer to home than we would wish. Before I could inquire further, footsteps approached in the corridor. Light, hesitant. Mrs. Marchmont appeared in the doorway, her eyes hollow from sleeplessness, her pale hands trembling against the dark fabric of her gown. You found him, she whispered. It was not a question but a statement of dread certainty. Holmes inclined his head slightly. We did, madam. I regret to inform you that your husband's body lies below the house. He appears to have perished several nights ago, likely on the night the knocking began. Her lips quivered, but no tears came. She moved into the room slowly, her gaze falling upon the scattered blueprints. He told me he was working on something grand, she said softly. Something that would restore his fortune. He said it would make us safe again. Holmes studied her carefully, his expression unreadable. Safe from what, Mrs. Marchmont? Her eyes darted toward him, then away. Debt, enemies, he had dealings, contracts that went wrong. I never asked for the details. He said it was better I did not know. Holmes rose, his movements deliberate, precise. And yet you knew of the vault beneath the house, did you not? She froze. The vault.
Come now,
Holmes said gently, though his gaze was sharp as a blade. The soil on your shoes the night you came to Baker Street, the faint scent of oil on your gloves, and the torn hem of your dress. These are not the marks of a woman confined by fear. You went below, Mrs. Marchmont. You have known of that chamber far longer than you have admitted. Her composure faltered. He told me never to speak of it, she whispered. He said it was where he kept his most valuable possessions. I thought he meant money, letters. Holmes stepped closer. And when the knocks began, you feared the past had come to claim you both. A sob escaped her then, sharp and sudden. I heard them every night, she said, always 3. He would sit by the fire, pale as death, and say nothing. Then one night he went below. I heard him open the panel in the floor, heard the latch, and then silence. The next evening, the knocking came again, but he never returned. Holmes's eyes softened slightly, though his mind was racing. You went down after him? She nodded. I tried. But the passage was filled with smoke, the air so thick I could hardly breathe. I thought, oh God, I thought he was trapped. I closed the door, sealed it, and prayed. I thought if the noise stopped, the house would be free. Holmes turned away, his voice quiet but edged with gravity. Instead, you sealed him in. The words hung in the air like a blade. Marchmont covered her face, trembling violently. Watson, ever the physician, moved to guide her to a chair. But Holmes remained standing, his gaze distant, focused not on the woman but on the floor beneath them. After a long silence, he said, Watson, fetch my lantern. I obeyed, and together we descended once more into the cellar. The smoke from the night's explosion had cleared, leaving behind the acrid scent of metal and ash. The vault stood open as we had left it, its air cool and stale. Holmes moved to the far corner where Marchmont's body lay, the brass key still clenched in his hand. He knelt, prying it free with delicate care. Then, with a glance toward the wall, he began to tap lightly along the stone surface. The sound was hollow in one section, different from the rest. He pressed there, and a panel slid open to reveal a narrow recess in the masonry. Inside lay a small iron chest. Holmes lifted it out, setting it upon the table. The lock matched the brass key precisely. With a soft click, it opened. Inside were bundles of documents, contracts, correspondences, coded messages, all stamped with the insignia we had seen before. Beneath them rested a single photograph, Eliza Marchmont, seated beside her husband, smiling faintly. But it was the man standing behind them that drew Holmes's attention. Colonel Hensley, he murmured. So the threads tightened. I frowned. The same Hensley who was accused of embezzlement from the Admiralty last year. The very same, Holmes said. Marchmont's former associate. It appears our late friend sought to shift blame for his own theft onto the Colonel. These letters confirm it. Fabricated invoices, forged signatures, planted evidence. And when the Colonel began to suspect, Marchmont panicked. He built this vault to hide both the stolen designs and his guilt. But his scheme was incomplete. Someone discovered it. Someone who modified the machinery to destroy him. I stared at him. You mean Mrs. Marchmont? Holmes was silent for a long moment, then he shook his head. No, her guilt lies in silence, not in cunning. The device was altered with professional precision. Only a man with mechanical training could have done it. There is, however, another name here. Hensley's assistant, a Mr. Carl Merrick, dismissed without cause 2 months ago. If my instincts are correct, he sought vengeance upon both men. When Marchmont refused to share the profit, or turned coward, Merrick chose to end the partnership permanently. He closed the chest and locked it again. We shall deliver this to Inspector Lestrade in the morning. Merrick's involvement will be plain once the codes are deciphered. Though we ascended in silence, the weight of discovery pressing upon us. In the parlor above, Mrs. Marchmont sat motionless by the window, the gray light of morning rendering her almost spectral. Holmes paused at the threshold, studying her. You were deceived, madam, he said softly. Your husband's sins were his own. Do not let the shadow of his work darken what remains of your life. She turned toward him, her eyes hollow but dry. And what remains, Mr. Holmes? She asked. What remains when every sound, every corner of this house, speaks of him? Holmes hesitated, then said quietly, truth remains. And with it peace, though seldom swiftly. We left her there, the fog lifting slowly beyond the windows, revealing the orchard in the pale light of day. As we stepped out into the open air, I breathed deeply, grateful for the cold wind against my face. Holmes stood beside me, his gaze fixed upon the ground as though he could still see the outline of the vault beneath our feet. A fitting epitaph? He said at last. The man beneath the floor sought to rise above his station through deceit, and in doing so, sank lower than any honest grave could take him. I said nothing. The morning sun broke faintly through the fog, casting long shadows across the orchard. Somewhere a crow called once, then fell silent, and as we walked away from Ravenscroft, the house loomed behind us. Silent now, its story told, its restless heart stilled at last. The light of dawn crept slowly over Ravenscroft Manor, seeping through the cracked window panes and tracing pale lines across the dust-coated floor. The house that had echoed with fear and deceit only hours before now lay hollow and strangely peaceful. A faint mist curled in from the moors, softening the sharp outlines of despair that clung to the old estate. Holmes stood near the hearth, his silhouette framed by the dying embers, and for the first time since our arrival, the great detective seemed still. I could not tell if it was wariness or reflection that anchored him so. Mrs. Marchmont sat on the edge of a chaise, her face a portrait of disbelief. The truth had been uncovered, the haunting silenced, the mystery dispelled. But in its wake remained a grief more terrible than the fear that preceded it. The man she had loved and mourned was neither ghost nor victim but architect of his own undoing. Her hands trembled upon her lap as she stared at the simple iron key Holmes had placed there. the key that had locked her husband inside the vault he had built to conceal his crimes. Holmes moved at last, his voice breaking the heavy silence. "There is always a method to madness, Mrs. Marchmont," he said quietly. "But rarely does that method escape the madness it breeds." Her eyes lifted to him, hollow and searching. "You mean to say, hey, he did all this himself?" she whispered. "The knocks, the whispers, the ghostly noises. He made them all." Holmes inclined his head. Indeed, what began as a ruse to frighten away suspicion became a snare of his own making. He was a man divided, half criminal, half coward. He feared exposure more than death itself, and so he buried the truth beneath the floorboards. Quite literally. He turned to me, gesturing toward the scattered remnants of the contraption we had dismantled. "A series of copper pipes, Watson, connected to a timed mechanism in the heating system, ingenious in its simplicity. Every stroke of midnight released steam that struck the wood in sequence, 3 distinct knocks. He designed it to coincide with the old stories of the house being haunted, thereby dissuading anyone from prying too closely into his affairs. I could still hear those eerie knocks echoing in memory, the hollow rhythm that had filled the manor with dread. But the 4th knock, I murmured, recalling the dreadful moment when the pattern changed and led us to the vault. Holmes's eyes flickered with somber triumph. Yes, that was no device. That was the last sound of his life, the final blow he struck against the door, seeking freedom from his own deception. The timing mechanism had misfired, sealing him inside as he worked to retrieve his forged documents. Fate, it seems, found him more efficient than the law ever could. Mrs. Marchmont's lips quivered, but no words came. She clutched the key tightly until her knuckles whitened. I felt an ache of pity stir within me. "Holmes," I said softly. Perhaps she should not hear more this morning. He gave me a brief, understanding glance, yet his tone remained steady, almost detached. "Truth, Watson, however cruel, is the only ghost worth confronting." Then he turned to the woman once more, his expression softening just slightly. "Madame, your husband's actions were not driven by malice toward you. He wished, I believe, to shield you from the disgrace his exposure would bring. The letters he burned, the stories he spread of the knocking spirit, they were desperate measures of a man cornered by his own past." She looked up through tears. "And what past was that, Mr. Holmes?" Holmes retrieved a folded document from the mantelpiece, the fragment of a burned letter we had found behind the fireplace. "Blackmail," he said simply. "Your husband had once been involved in the theft of confidential designs from the War Office. His partner, Colonel Hensley, attempted to extort him years later. The knocking began soon after. Marchmont's plan was to fake his death, plant evidence to incriminate Hensley, and vanish under a new name abroad. But the vault he built to store his falsified papers became his tomb." A Watson's pen scratched faintly in the background as I noted these words, though the act felt mechanical. Holmes's logic was flawless, his deductions crystalline, but there was a sadness about the case that logic could not cleanse. The house, now still, seemed to mourn with her. A clock somewhere down the hall began to strike the hour, 7 chimes that fell heavy and deliberate through the cold air. Mrs. Marchmont rose, moving toward the window. The morning light framed her like a ghost in reverse, no longer the image of fear, but of a life emptied by truth. "What am I to do now?" she asked, more to herself than to us. Holmes regarded her for a long moment before replying. "Live," he said finally. "That is the one mystery your husband could not solve. Do not inherit his fear." She turned away, and I sensed that there was nothing more to be said. Holmes motioned toward the door, and we stepped out into the corridor. The manor's walls, once filled with whispers, now seemed to listen in silence as our footsteps receded toward the great hall. The morning air outside bit sharply, carrying with it the faint scent of smoke and damp earth. Holmes paused upon the threshold, glancing back once toward the house before descending the steps. As we made our way down the long drive, the mist began to lift. The orchard, the scene of our earlier encounter, stood quiet under the pale sun. The broken pocket watch I had found there the night before still ticked faintly in my pocket, its rhythm strangely comforting. I drew it out and turned it over in my hand. "Strange, isn't it?" I said. "How something meant to mark the passage of time becomes instead a witness to its final moment." Holmes gave a faint smile. "Time, Watson, is the one adversary man cannot outwit. Mr. Marchmont sought to delay justice, but in doing so he hastened it. He stopped beside the carriage waiting for us and looked toward the distant road. The world is full of such paradoxes, men who spend their lives concealing truths that would harm them less than the lies they build in defense." The coachman, half asleep, stirred as Holmes tapped the side of the carriage with his cane. As we climbed aboard, I noticed his gaze fixed not on the road ahead but on the horizon, as though searching for something far beyond the physical landscape. The wheels began to turn, crunching over the gravel, and the manor grew smaller behind us. After a time, I broke the silence. "Holmes, do you ever tire of these cases? of staring so constantly into the darker corners of human nature. He leaned back against the seat, his eyes half closed, and for a moment I thought he might not answer. Then he said quietly, "No, Watson, it is within those shadows that truth is most often found. What I tire of is the world's insistence on disguising its ghosts as mysteries, when they are, in fact, simply men and women bound by fear." He opened his eyes and met mine. Last night, the dead did not knock for vengeance. They knocked for remembrance. And that, I think, is all any soul truly seeks. The words lingered long after we had left the moor behind. London greeted us hours later, its familiar fog rolling like a curtain over the gaslights, muffling the city in its eternal hum. We returned to Baker Street just as the lamplighter passed by, his pole raised high, kindling tiny suns in the gathering gloom. Inside, the fire was still smoldering in the grate where we had left it 2 nights before. I poured 2 cups of tea, and Holmes took his usual seat by the window, the gray city stretching endlessly beyond. He removed the pocket watch I had handed him earlier and set it on the table. Its hands had stopped, frozen forever at 12 o'clock. He regarded it thoughtfully. "Midnight again," he murmured. "Curious how time returns us always to the hour of reckoning." I said nothing, letting the quiet fill the room. The case of the Marchmonts was over, its puzzles unraveled, its ghosts laid to rest. Yet something in Holmes's expression told me his mind was already moving, seeking the next enigma that would stir his restless intellect. Outside, a carriage passed, wheels splashing through puddles, and somewhere in the distance, a clock struck the half-hour. Holmes leaned forward, the faintest smile touching his lips. "Do you hear it, Watson?" "Hear what?" "The city knocking," he said softly, not with fear, but with possibility. "Another midnight waits somewhere beyond that fog, and with it, another truth." And as the sound of London deepened around us, the clip of hooves, the hiss of rain, the whisper of unseen lives, I realized that for Sherlock Holmes, the knocking never truly ceased. It merely changed its source, shifting from manor walls to the very heartbeat of the world itself.